We have a special guest joining us here on the stream today. Rebecca Bromley-Trujillo is the research director at the Wason Center for Civic Leadership. She's an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Christopher Newport University, and she has taken some time out of what I'm sure is a very busy day to spend with us here on Live Impact News. Rebecca, how are you today? Thanks so much for stopping by.
The point being, the
I'm
judge
doing
can
very
know
well.
people
How are you doing?
around town.
I am doing great. We're digging through this survey all morning here as we received your guys' update. We're going to dig into some of the findings here in particular, but first I just wanted to ask you, going through this process and then finally releasing everything out to the public, what is it like for you to have just kind of come to the conclusion of what I'm sure is a very, very big project?
I mean, every year we do the State of the Commonwealth survey. We try to tap into the issues that the General Assembly is thinking about, and that process alone takes quite a bit of research and time, and so we hope to cover as many topics as possible, and I think the results are fascinating, and they really inform the democratic process, so excited to jump in.
Agreed. You talk about the results being fascinating. We'll just start with what jumped out to you as maybe the or some of the most fascinating results that you got.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different elements here. This is a very policy-heavy survey. And so I'd say there's kind of some big takeaways about how people are generally feeling. So we always start off by asking, do you feel like the direction of the Commonwealth is going in a good direction? How do you feel about the direction of the country? And I'd say that folks clearly seem more optimistic about the Commonwealth than they do about the country. So right now, only 28% of Virginians think that the country is moving in the right direction, whereas 65% say wrong. That really stood out, that this feeling that people are really unhappy, especially with national level politics. And that also comes through in Trump's approval rating, which is the lowest that I have seen in a Virginia survey. 34% approve of Trump's performance, 62% disapprove. And so there's a lot going on there. But when you kind of shift to looking at the state level, people seem a little bit more optimistic. So we asked them about, newly inaugurated Governor Spanberger and whether they feel optimistic or pessimistic about her term as governor. 60% say they're optimistic and 33% say pessimistic. And then you kind of move into the issues and you see a lot of support for some of the things that Spanberger ran on and that the Democratic majority in our state legislature is carrying forward.
And then two follow-up questions for you based on that answer. When you say the lowest approval rating for Trump that you've seen, does that stretch back to his first term as well?
It does. So I looked all the way back, and in 2017, he had a 35% approval rating, but this one is even lower than that. So it has not gotten lower.
Okay. And then when it comes to the 60% who say they are optimistic about Spanberger's upcoming gubernatorial term, is that a normal number for the start of a gubernatorial term? How does that compare to the start of Youngkin's term?
I would say that, so we did not ask this precise question when Youngkin started, but what I'd say is it's a little bit higher than I might expect. However, Virginians do tend to be more friendly towards their governors than towards presidents. So some of that is coming through. And obviously, she also was just elected, so there was a lot of support for her candidacy. And so I think that it makes sense that it's sort of filtering into the start of her term. But it's definitely a little bit higher than I think many would expect.
Okay, and then when it comes to that comparison of optimistic about the state versus optimistic about the country, I believe I saw here, going through the numbers, we see some that stretch up into the 80s, some that stretch up into the 90s, but there is a 100% that jumped out to me as well, and that is 100% of Democrats say the country is headed in the wrong direction. How rare is it to see a 100% on any of these questions?
Almost never. When I saw that, I triple checked it because I thought, really? 100% of Democrats say the country is going in the wrong direction. That's very rare. Usually you'll even get 1 or 2%. And even on Trump's approval rating, 1% of Democrats approved of his performance. So usually there's at least somebody out there. So yeah, that's shocking in its way.
Yeah, and when it comes to staying on that topic of national versus state, obviously you're working strictly with Virginians here at CNU at the Wason Center.
Yeah.
But when you see that dichotomy of more Virginians are optimistic, whereas more Virginians are pessimistic about the country. Is that something that you believe would hold true throughout the 50 states? Is that approval in the state or optimism about the state is higher than it is as the nation overall?
I would guess usually, yes. Usually people are feeling a little bit better about their state governments than they are about the national government. But this level is much higher than I think is typical for sure.
Yeah. And then, a statement that I hear a lot, sort of in modern politics or even just modern American society, is we're more divided than ever before. That sort of rhetoric and that sort of thought process when it comes to the right versus the left, conservatives versus liberals, Democrats versus Republicans. In your survey, there's a number of issues where there is that sort of stark disagreement, but there are also issues where there's a lot of common ground: data centers, union representation for non-union members, sick leave, medical leave, things like that. When it comes to the division, that sort of dividing line between Democrat versus Republican, did you find that there was more common ground than usual, or did things shake out as they typically do in terms of that divide?
That's a great question. I think so. We are seeing clear common ground. The data centers is really fascinating because this is not an issue that has always been partisan, but certainly it has been in the past. And so to see both Democrats, Republicans, and independents support limits on data centers shows a real clear shift and a lot of people agreeing there. Certainly, we're also seeing a lot of agreement on things like paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave. Those numbers are really high. Definitely a number of Republicans are supporting those policies, not just Democrats and independents. And then even on something like the minimum wage, which typically the Republican Party does not support, almost half of Republicans support this. Not quite half, but it gets pretty close. And so there's clearly some division within the party on that, but there's a lot of common ground among Virginians on that policy. And what I tell my students very often is that it appears that we're extremely divided, and in many ways we are. But when you start getting into the weeds of policy, there's actually a lot of common ground that I think is unexpected for people. And then we are seeing some of that in this survey. Now, clearly, there are areas where the parties disagree, and things like the constitutional amendments on reproductive rights and felon reenfranchisement, there's definitely pretty obvious partisan differences on those, as are partisan differences in the redistricting, the potential for drawing new lines. So certainly there are some partisan divisions, but it's not maybe as much as people think it is.
Which is good to see, and which I think is an important reminder, right? Because especially when we focus, a lot of the national focus is on those hot button issues where there's clear divide. But then you dig into a survey like this and you see so many issues where there is a lot of common ground. I think it's illuminating and it's a good reminder. I want to stick on one of those issues where there is that common ground, those data centers. What to you stood out about your polling around data centers?
So there tends to be, so in my field, I study environmental policy, and there tends to appear to be a divide on things like renewable energy. But when you look at these data on in the survey on data centers, even a majority of Republicans support requiring new data centers to use renewables or nuclear power. And so that suggests that there's been a meaningful shift. Now, tons of unity around things like requiring site assessments for data centers to look at their potential impact on things like water usage, the electric grid, carbon emissions, and agricultural impacts. So really high support for that. 86% support that in our survey. And then also 81% support doing a noise study if you're going to locate a data center in your homes or schools. And so there's actually a ton of common ground, and there's very little partisan difference on those questions.
I want to ask a more theoretical question in regards to that issue. And if you kind of want to say, hey, well, I'd rather just kind of focus on the survey, that's a difficult thing to prognosticate about in this setting, please feel free. When it comes to data centers, we talk about, like you said, a lot of common ground on a lot of different aspects of that issue. It's also a very new issue. Do you think that there is any credibility to the thought process that being such a new issue, there are campaigns have not gotten a hold of it, the media has not gotten a hold of it as much, it has not become something that is used so much in society on different sides and in different narratives, but rather is something that, because it's so new and because it's sort of untouched by all the different mechanisms of the United States, it allows for there to be more common ground because it hasn't been politicized in any way, shape, or form. Is there any credibility to that sort of, I don't know, that thought process?
Yeah, so I would say oftentimes people's opinions are guided by political elites, so elected officials and also the media. And so if those folks have not really tapped into the issue yet, it doesn't allow for that polarization around party to occur. And so I do think there is something to that, what you're saying. And it's not necessarily a criticism of the public, but we do tend to, okay, what does my political party say? I'm going to move towards that. That's a common thing that people do, and so it's kind of nice to see that, okay, when we can just sort of think and not really hear others in our ear, we do actually have a lot of common ground.
Right. Another thing that's kind of illuminating when we think about that division that we're told so often has kind of taken hold of the country. Now, I want to talk policy issues that you've seen a major change in. Are there any policy issues where over the course of the last maybe decade, maybe 5 years, you've seen a stark change in how they're viewed by Virginians?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly, well, even literally data centers have shifted as people get more information. So we have seen shifts in that in our polling. I would say a lot of the issues that we polled on today, though, have received fairly consistent support in the past. So we have definitely asked many times, for instance, about marijuana retail sale. Every year that it's come up in the General Assembly, we've asked the question. That's stuck around 60% support for allowing a retail market for marijuana to happen in Virginia. And so you do see some consistency. There are other issues where it really shifts depending on the context. And so, like, for instance, gun related issues tend to really ebb and flow depending on whether there's been a recent shooting or a recent devastating event. And so we do see people wanting more strict gun laws following a mass shooting or other major events. And then we see them kind of moving away from that the further removed they get from those events. And so that happens with a lot of issues. But as far as sort of a long trend that has gone in one direction, I can't say that any of the issues we surveyed on today show that sort of clear pattern. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and we hear affordability is kind of the buzzword when it comes to national politics right now and on down into Virginia politics. Many of the Democratic officials who were elected in this most recent cycle focused quite a bit on affordability, and it seems to be something that had real traction with the public. Anything about your survey that kind of backs up or can help to explain why that was the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, certainly Abigail Spanberger, Governor Spanberger, has been talking heavily about affordability, and she's mentioned a lot of different policies, some of which we cover here. And so you're really seeing that support around things like paid family and medical leave and increasing the minimum wage. And so these get high support. So the family and medical leave gets 84% support in our survey, $15 minimum wage, 78% support. And so that's clearly resonated. And I actually also think that's one of the reasons we have these high numbers for the data center policies, because there's an affordability concern around energy, and data centers can contribute to high energy prices. And so I think that's part of that narrative about affordability.
Yeah, definitely. And then when it comes to, you break these down in a lot of different demographics, I'm wondering if there were any issues that stood out as particularly important to young people, not just in their numbers with young people, but young people caring more about any particular issues than maybe older generations or generations that came before them do in this survey.
Yeah, so I mean, top issues for young people in the survey are definitely pretty heavily concentrated around inflation. So that's true of a lot of Virginians, but young people even more so. They're new in the workforce or entering the workforce, and really concerned about being able to afford things. And so as costs rise, they're naturally concerned. And so we definitely see that. As far as a standalone issue, On average, we tend to see more young folks concerned about reproductive rights.
Mm.
And that's something we've also surveyed our students at CNU, and that has been consistently a top issue among CNU students. And I think that's the case among a lot of young people.
Is that something that you've seen increase since the controversial Supreme Court ruling when Roe v. Wade was overturned?
Yes, absolutely. That has.
And then you talk about your students. I'm wondering, do you have a group of students that work with you on this? Is it something you talk about regularly in your classes? I mean, what is the student body involvement when it comes to this survey?
Yeah, so we have students in the Wason Center called Wason Scholars, and a number of them serve on the Wason Survey Committee. And so they work with me on surveys. They get to write their own survey that they give to the CNU student population, and they learn a lot from that process. And so it's really a joy to work with the students. And I certainly talk about these surveys in my classes. So I traditionally teach things like American political behavior and campaigns and elections. And so they get to learn how the process works for writing a survey, how the methodology works in terms of the survey weights, and how you can trust some surveys over others based on the kinds of methods that they're using. And so for me, it's really important that students learn the process and understand how important it is to write these fair questions and nonpartisan questions to really understand where people are coming from and just to inform the broader democratic process.
And you mentioned, how do you know you can trust a survey? You talked about nonpartisan questions already as a key factor and something that is important in creating a trustworthy survey. What are some of the other main ingredients to a survey that you can trust the results of?
Yeah, so there's a few things I would always look for in a survey that's coming out. One of them is sample size. We at the Wason Center, I say we have the gold standard. We always go for at least 800 Virginia registered voters. You do not actually need 800 to get a true representation of the state as long as you are using random sampling. So you would draw a random sample and then you random digit dial those folks. And then we also use what are called survey weights. So anytime you do a random draw and then you call people, there will be some people that are more likely to pick up the phone than others. And you have to account for that in your survey weighting process at the back end after the survey is conducted. And so we make sure that we are weighting our surveys to reflect the different regions of the state, different racial groups, gender, and education. And this is just to make sure that this is actually representative of the Virginia registered voter population. The other key thing to see is, does the organization report a margin of error? If they are not reporting that, you should not trust that survey. All surveys have some error, right? This is a random draw and it could deviate from the actual population. And so that's something you should always see reported. And so I think sample size, method of how you're contacting people and whether it's random and whether you're reporting out key data and using survey weights. Those are the main things.
Okay, and then when it comes to digging in a little deeper into the numbers, when you see a governor who has such a high optimism rating going into her term, you know that you'll be doing this survey again before long. Is it just natural attrition that will come down a little bit? And why is that, if yes is the answer?
Yes, I would say generally people tend to be more optimistic at the beginning. That's not always the case, but usually, yes. I have a lot of hope. Okay, this is what this person wants to achieve. And then once they get into actually governing, it turns out to be really difficult to pass major policy and to make big impacts and reforms. And so I think people start with a lot of hope and maybe they're feeling let down sometimes. Because our political process moves slow. It's very difficult sometimes to get things done. And so people get frustrated by that. That said, I've certainly seen, approval ratings ebb and flow. And so it's certainly not one trajectory. And so we will see, I'm sure Spanberger will have moments where she has a much higher approval rating and others where maybe it's lower. But on average, we do tend to be nicer to our governors than our presidents.
Yeah, and then in terms of our outgoing governor, Governor Youngkin, 44% approval rating for him on his way out of office. Where does that sort of fall in terms of the average that you're likely to see?
Yeah, so it's hard to compare because we don't always ask this question at precisely the same time. That said, this is a little low, especially low for Youngkin himself. His approval rating in our polls typically are around 50%, 52%, 53%. So it's definitely a bit low, but I think it does reflect that he was outgoing, and there's a lot of angst about inflation and the economy, and so that often plays into approval ratings. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's kind of experiencing some hits from how things are going economically.
Okay, and then you mentioned the gold standard. You've been the gold standard as an interview guest as well. We really appreciate you staying with
Oh,
us
thanks.
for all this time, answering all these questions. Is there anything else that you want to illuminate about the survey for our viewers before we let you go?
I just want to reiterate that we actually have a lot in common as Virginians. And so try to focus on that. I know it's easy to get caught up in the divide between the parties, but really there's a lot of common ground. And I hope we're able to build on that over the next few years.
Yeah, and it's a very clear takeaway looking at some of these numbers. It definitely more common ground than you would think, just kind of moving through everyday life in a very, very difficult time here in the United States. So we appreciate you sitting with us and kind of going through all the numbers with us. And I hope that you get a little break after this and kind of relax at least
Thank
for a little
you.
bit now that this is out. And hopefully we get to have you on again as more surveys are released in the future.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Rebecca.